The wind had a name in this part of Kansas. It was not a gentle name whispered by young lovers beneath summer moons. It was a harsh, grating name spoken by men with cracked lips and sun-damaged skin. It was the kind of wind that carried no relief in the merciless heat of 1876, only the fine red dust of the plains and the scent of earth baked dry under an unforgiving sun. But that wind would come later in the story proper. First, there was a different wind entirely. The cool spring breeze of March 1916 carrying with it the smell of freshly turned soil and the promise of planting season. Ethan Brennan sat in his rocking chair on the wide front porch of his farmhouse, watching the last light of day paint the Kansas prairie in shades of amber and gold. At 72 years old, his hands were gnarled with arthritis. His back stooped from 4 decades of hard labor, but his eyes remained sharp. Those pale gray blue eyes that had seen so much, survived so much, and held within them a story that needed telling. Beside him sat his grandson Thomas, 18 years old, with the gangly awkwardness of youth not yet grown into manhood. In the boy's hands, folded and refolded a dozen times already, was a piece of paper that had arrived that morning. A notice from the United States Army, a draft notice. Tomorrow Thomas would board a train at the Millbrook station and travel to Fort Riley for basic training. From there, if the rumors were true, he would ship across the Atlantic to fight in the Great War consuming Europe. The boy was afraid. Ethan could see it in the way Thomas's fingers worried at the edges of the paper and the tightness around his mouth, in the way his gaze kept drifting to the horizon as if seeking an escape route that did not exist. "Grandpa," Thomas said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do you know if you're brave enough?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment. He reached into the pocket of his worn work vest and withdrew something small, something he had carried every day for 40 years. A ring, if you could call it that. Not gold or silver, but braided leather. Brown and blue threads woven together with the kind of care that spoke of hours spent in careful work. The colors had faded over the decades, the leather cracked and worn smooth by constant handling, but it remained intact. "You want to know about courage?" Ethan's voice was deep, roughened by age, but still strong. "Let me tell you about your grandmother." Thomas looked at the braided ring, confused. "Grandma, this story isn't about war, boy. It's about a different kind of battle. The kind fought inside a man's chest when everything he thought he knew about himself turns out to be wrong." Ethan settled back in his chair, the old wood creaking beneath his weight. "It's about the summer of 1876 when I bought your grandmother like a man buys a horse, and about the night she arrived when I made a choice that changed everything." The sun touched the horizon, bleeding red across the endless sky. Ethan closed his eyes and the years fell away like autumn leaves. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of memory, of truth long held close, of a story that began not with love, but with something far more desperate. It started 3 days before she arrived, when she was still just a girl named Margaret Hayes, terrified and alone in a wagon traveling across land she'd never seen to marry a man whose face she'd never looked upon. The transition was seamless, the old man's voice fading into the past, into the story itself. 3 days. That was how long Margaret Hayes had been traveling in the back of the covered wagon, and she had counted every miserable hour of every endless day. 19 years old, with skin too pale for the relentless prairie sun and hands that had known work. But never this kind of heat, this kind of dust, this kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came not from labor, but from fear. The wagon lurched over another rut in the barely visible trail, and Maggie's teeth clicked together hard enough to send a spike of pain through her jaw. She sat with her back rigid against the rough wooden bench, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned to pale stones. Through the gap in the canvas cover, she could see nothing but brown grass stretching to meet a washed-out sky, a horizon that seemed to mock her with its emptiness. This was not how a bride was supposed to travel to her wedding. But then this was not a wedding. It was a transaction, a sale, a debt settled with flesh and blood instead of coin, though coin had certainly changed hands. $500, that was her price. $300 in cash paid to her father, $200 in forgiven debt to the bank that had been slowly strangling her family's small Ohio farm. $500 for a daughter who had become, through no fault of her own, too expensive to keep. The memory of that conversation played behind Maggie's closed eyelids like a cruel stage show she could not stop watching. Her father, unable to meet her eyes, staring instead at a loose floorboard while he mumbled words about arrangements and provisions and doing what had to be done. Her mother turning away to face the wall, shoulders shaking with silent tears she was too proud or too ashamed to let fall openly. Her four younger siblings, too young to fully understand, but old enough to know their big sister was being sent away, clinging to her skirts and crying. And the man from Kansas, the broker he called himself. Samuel Pritchard, with his neat suit and his leather portfolio full of contracts, and his smooth assurances that this was all perfectly legal, perfectly normal, perfectly fine. Mail-order brides, he had explained, were a necessity on the frontier where women were scarce and men needed help running their claims. The gentleman in question was a respectable farmer with 160 acres, a solid cabin, and the means to provide for a wife. The gentleman in question. As if calling him a gentleman made this any less grotesque. Her father had signed the papers. Not Maggie. She had never put her name to any document, had never given her consent in writing. But at 19, still under her father's authority by law, her consent had not been required. The marriage had been performed by proxy, a legal peculiarity of the territories where a bride's physical presence was optional as long as her father agreed to the match. So here she was, married to a stranger, traveling to a place she had never seen, about to begin a life she had never chosen. The driver, a taciturn man named Silas Kern, who smelled of tobacco and unwashed wool, had not spoken more than 20 words to her in 3 days. Once on the first day, he had pointed to a distant smudge of green on the horizon and said, "Cottonwoods means water." That had been the extent of their conversation. For the rest of the journey, he simply drove, his weathered hands loose on the reins, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. Maggie had grown up in noise. Her family's small cabin had always been filled with the chatter of her siblings, the hum of her mother's singing, the creak of floorboards, under too many feet moving in too small a space. Silence had been a luxury, something to be stolen in the early morning hours before the household woke. Here there was nothing but silence. The vast, oppressive silence of empty land. It made every small sound seem enormous. The creak of the wagon wheels, the jingle of the harness, the wind whispering through the canvas. Her own heartbeat loud in her ears like a drum counting down to something terrible. She had heard stories about wedding nights. Whispered stories from older girls who giggled nervously and blushed when they spoke of what happened between a man and wife in the darkness of the marriage bed. Stories from her mother delivered with tight lips and averted eyes about a woman's duty and how it was best to close one's eyes and think of something pleasant until it was over. Stories from the wife of the blacksmith back home, a woman worn thin by 7 pregnancies, who had told Maggie in a rare moment of brutal honesty that some men were gentle and some were not, and there was no way to know which kind you had married until it was too late. Maggie was terrified, not of work. She knew work. She had spent her childhood helping her mother manage a household of 6 on almost nothing, had learned to stretch a sack of cornmeal across a week to make soap from lye and fat to patch clothes until more of the fabric was patch than original cloth. She could handle work, but this, the thought of lying beneath a stranger of hands on her body that she had never invited, of pain she was told to expect and endure because that was simply what wives did. The thought made her stomach clench and her breath come quick and shallow. She had spent 3 days preparing herself for it, steeling herself, building walls inside her mind, behind which she could retreat when the moment came. She was not ready. She would never be ready. But ready or not, the moment was coming. The wagon lurched to a sudden stop. The cessation of motion was so abrupt, so unexpected after 3 days of constant movement that Maggie actually gasped. Her hands flew to the edge of the bench to steady herself, and for a moment the only sound was her own ragged breathing and the wind whistling around the corners of the canvas cover. Then Silas's voice, gruff and matter-of-fact. "We're here." 2 words. That was all. "We're here." As if they had simply arrived at a market town or a Sunday social, as if this were not the end of one life and the beginning of another that Maggie had not chosen and did not want. Her hands were shaking. She laced her fingers together and squeezed, trying to stop the trembling, but it only made it worse. Her whole body was shaking now, a fine tremor that started in her core and radiated outward until even her teeth were chattering, despite the heat. "Move," she told herself. "You have to move. Sitting here won't change anything. The man is waiting. Your husband is waiting." The word tasted like ash in her mouth. Husband. She forced her rigid fingers to release the bench, forced her legs to shift to prepare to stand, forced herself to lean forward and push aside the canvas flap that separated the enclosed wagon bed from the driver's bench and the world beyond. The light was blinding. After 3 days in the dimness of the covered wagon, the full afternoon sun of the Kansas prairie hit her eyes like a physical blow. She blinked rapidly, tears streaming down her cheeks from the sudden brightness, and for several long seconds she could see nothing but white light and dancing spots. When her vision finally cleared, she saw what would become her entire world. A cabin, small but solid, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with a mixture of mud and straw. The roof was sod green with grass that had taken root in the packed earth. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, the only sign of life in the vast emptiness. Beside the cabin stood a barn larger than she had expected, its wood weathered to a silver gray that spoke of hard winters survived. Beyond that, nothing but land. Endless, undulating land plowed into neat, dark furrows that stretched toward the horizon like the lines on an old man's face. 160 acres. A quarter section, the legal minimum for a homestead claim under the Act of 1862. It did not look like much, but Maggie knew from her father's bitter complaints about land prices back in Ohio that this much property would be worth a small fortune in more settled areas. Out here, where the government was practically giving land away to anyone willing to work it, the value was not in the land itself, but in what a man could coax from the soil through years of back-breaking labor. Her eyes tracked across the property, cataloging details the way her mother had taught her to assess a household. The cabin had one window, a real window with glass, which was a luxury. The barn was well maintained, the fence lines straight and sturdy. There was a chicken coop near the barn, and she could hear the soft clucking of hens. A vegetable garden had been planted near the cabin, the rows neat and carefully weeded. Whoever lived here took pride in his work. Whoever lived here. Her husband. And then she saw him. He was not standing on the porch like a groom waiting for his bride. He was walking from the direction of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his belt, moving with the unhurried, deliberate pace of a man for whom this was just another day, just another chore to be completed before the sun set and the workday ended. He was tall. That was her first impression. Taller than her father, taller than any of the men she had known back in Ohio. 6 feet at least, maybe more, with shoulders that had been broadened by years of physical labor. He wore a simple linen shirt faded from many washings and canvas work trousers held up by leather suspenders. No jacket despite the formality of the occasion. No hat, though most men out here wore broad-brimmed hats to protect against the sun. His hair was dark brown, the color of rich soil, and long enough to brush the collar of his shirt. It moved slightly in the wind. His face was weathered tan, the deep brown of a man who spent 14 hours a day working under an open scandon. There were lines carved around his eyes and mouth, but they were lines of labor rather than laughter. His jaw was clean-shaven, which surprised her. Most frontier men wore beards, but it was his eyes that held her. Even from this distance, she could see they were pale, gray-blue like the winter sky. They looked at her now with a flat, assessing gaze. Not welcome, not desire, not even curiosity. Just assessment. The look a man gives a tool he has purchased and must now determine whether it will serve its purpose. She shivered despite the heat. He walked closer, and Maggie could see him more clearly. He was young, she realized with a start. Younger than she had expected. Not the grizzled old widower she had been imagining, but a man perhaps in his early 30s. Old enough to have the hardness of experience, but young enough that there was no gray in his hair, no stoop to his shoulders. Silas climbed down from the wagon with a grunt, his joints cracking audibly. He addressed the man without preamble. "Brought her safe, just like I promised." The man gave one curt nod. He reached into his pocket, and Maggie heard the clink of coins. Money changed hands. 5 gold eagle coins, $10 each, $50 total for the cost of transport. She knew because the broker had explained the full financial arrangement to her father in her presence, listing every expense as if she were livestock being shipped across state lines. The man counted the coins with quick efficiency, then pocketed them without comment. He bent and picked up Maggie's small canvas satchel from where Silas had set it on the ground. Everything she owned in the world. One change of clothes, a hairbrush that had belonged to her grandmother, a Bible with pressed flowers between its pages. A life that fit in a bag small enough to carry with one hand. Silas tipped his hat to the man, not to Maggie. He climbed back onto the wagon, clicked his tongue to the horses, and drove away without a backwards glance. Maggie watched the wagon disappear into its own cloud of red dust. That was it then. Her last connection to the world she had known was rolling away across the prairie, leaving her alone with this silent stranger who had paid good money for the privilege of calling her wife. She stood frozen, unable to make her legs move from the relative safety of the spot where the wagon had deposited her. The man looked at her for a long moment. His expression gave nothing away. Then he spoke for the first time, and his voice was deep and steady. "You can come inside now." Not a request, not an invitation. Simply a statement of fact, the next step in a transaction that had already been completed without her consent. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else as she gathered her skirts and followed him toward the cabin. The distance was perhaps 30 feet, but it felt like miles. Each step was a march towards something final, something she could never take back. There was no wedding, no preacher standing beneath a flower-covered arch, no witnesses dabbing their eyes with handkerchiefs, no music, no flowers, no celebration. Her marriage was this: a silent walk from a dusty wagon to a cabin door, a transaction completed, a life sold, and a girl who had no idea that everything she believed about her future was about to be proven wrong. Inside the cabin, the air was blessedly cool after the relentless heat of the journey. It smelled of wood smoke and pine, a clean smell that was somehow comforting despite Maggie's fear. The space was simple but well-maintained. A stone hearth dominated the far wall with a low fire burning despite the warmth of the day. A solid wooden table stood in the center of the room with two chairs tucked beneath it. There was a shelf with tin plates and cups, a small window letting in the fading afternoon light, and against the far wall, a bed. Maggie's eyes fixed on that bed immediately, and her breath caught in her throat. It was neatly made with a quilt in shades of blue and brown, the pillows plump and clean. It looked like a sentence waiting to be carried out. The man set her satchel down beside the door without ceremony. He crossed to the hearth where a pot hung over the fire and stirred it with a long wooden spoon. Then he ladled stew into two tin bowls and set them on the table. "Sit," he said, not unkindly but not gently either, simply a direction to be followed. Maggie sat because she did not know what else to do. The chair was hard beneath her, but after 3 days on the wagon bench, anything that was not moving felt like luxury. She looked at the bowl in front of her, venison stew with turnips and carrots and wild onions. It smelled good, rich and savory with just the right amount of salt. The meat looked tender, cooked until it would fall apart at the touch of a spoon. He had made this. Her husband, this silent man who had purchased her, had spent time preparing a meal for her arrival. The thought was strange, unsettling. She did not know what to do with it. They ate in complete silence. Maggie forced herself to swallow each bite even though fear had stolen all flavor from her mouth. The food turned to ash on her tongue, but she ate anyway because not eating would be worse, would make her seem ungrateful, might anger him. She did not yet know what angered him, what pleased him, what would make him raise his voice or his hand. So she ate the flavorless stew and kept her eyes on her bowl and counted her own heartbeats. 47. That was how many times he raised his spoon to his mouth during the meal. She counted each one, watching from beneath her lowered lashes, trying to learn something, anything about this man, to whom she now belonged. When the meal was finished, he collected both bowls and washed them in a basin of water, then set them aside to dry. His movements were efficient, practiced, the movements of a man who had lived alone for a very long time. Then he spoke again. "Need to check the animals before dark." He stepped outside and the door closed behind him with a soft click. Maggie sat alone in the dimming cabin and felt the fear rise up in her throat like bile. This was it, the waiting. He was giving her time to prepare herself, time to change into her nightgown, time to get into that bed and wait for him to return and claim what he had paid for. Her hands shook as she stood and retrieved her satchel. Inside was the thin cotton nightgown she had packed. It had been washed so many times the fabric was nearly transparent. She had no fine trousseau, no silk or lace, just this worn nightgown that had served her for years and would now serve her for this. She changed quickly, modestly, even though there was no one to see, folded her travel dress and set it carefully aside. The nightgown hung loose on her frame, doing nothing to hide the shape of her body beneath. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like prey waiting for the predator to return. She sat on the edge of the bed and waited, her fingers twisted together in her lap, nails digging into skin. Her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her temples, in her throat, behind her eyes. She thought about praying, but what would she pray for? To be treated gently, to survive, to somehow escape a fate that had already been sealed by her father's signature. And this man's money, God had not listened to her prayers before. She did not expect him to start now. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The light outside faded from gold to amber to deep orange. The fire in the hearth crackled and popped, sending shadows dancing across the log walls. Maggie sat and waited and tried to prepare herself for what was coming. Finally, she heard footsteps outside. The door opened. She flinched at the sound, her whole body going rigid. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, unable to look up, unable to watch him approach. She heard him move across the room, heard him add a log to the fire, heard the flames catch and flare with renewed vigor, heard his footsteps coming closer. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreading since her father told her about the arrangement. The moment when she would have to endure a stranger's hands on her body, a stranger's weight pressing her into the mattress, a stranger's breath on her face while he took what he had bought. She squeezed her eyes shut. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely control them. She waited for his hand on her shoulder, waited for him to push her back onto the bed, waited for the weight of him, the pain she had been promised to expect. But none of that happened. Instead, she heard him walk past her, heard the creak of the wooden chest at the foot of the bed, heard fabric rustling. Slowly, cautiously, she opened her eyes. Ethan Brennan was spreading a blanket on the floor. Right there on the hard wooden planks in front of the hearth, he was laying out a thick wool blanket and smoothing it flat with careful precision. Maggie watched in utter confusion as he lay down on that blanket, on his back, at first staring up at the rough ceiling beams. Then he pulled the blanket up to his chest, folded his hands over his stomach and turned onto his side. Away from the bed, away from her, his back facing her, a clear and deliberate choice. He did not speak, did not explain, did not even look at her. He simply settled himself on the hard floor as if this were the most natural thing in the world, as if this were how all men spent their wedding nights, and closed his eyes. Maggie sat frozen on the edge of the bed, unable to process what was happening. She had prepared herself for pain. She had prepared herself for tears. She had prepared herself to endure whatever she had to endure because that was what women did. She had not prepared herself for this, for kindness, for consideration, for a man who would choose the cold, hard floor over claiming what was legally, contractually, irrevocably his. The realization settled over her slowly like the first frost of winter. He was not coming to the bed. He was not going to touch her. He was not going to demand anything from her tonight. He had given her something she never expected to receive. He had given her choice. He had given her space. He had given her time. In a world where she had been sold like property transferred from her father's house to this stranger's cabin, like a piece of furniture or a milk cow, this silent, stoic man had given her dignity. The kindness of it struck her harder than cruelty ever could. Something broke inside her then. Something that had been holding together by threads for 3 long days. For 3 long years, if she was being honest with herself. The tears came before she could stop them, sliding silently down her cheeks and soaking into the pillow as she lay down fully on the bed. She pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from making any sound. She did not want him to hear. Did not want him to know that she was crying. Not from fear now, but from relief so overwhelming it hurt. She cried for her mother, for her father, for the life she had left behind and would never see again, for the childhood that had ended the moment those papers were signed. But mostly she cried because she had been ready for the worst, and instead she had received a mercy she did not know how to process. She fell asleep with tears still wet on her face. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was the steady rise and fall of his shoulder beneath the blanket. He never stirred, never looked back. But somehow that silent presence on the floor beside the fire was the safest she had felt in months. When morning light crept through the small window, Maggie woke slowly, disoriented. For a moment, she forgot where she was. She reached for the familiar warmth of her younger sister, who had shared her bed back home, but her hands found only empty space and the realization came flooding back. The cabin, the man, the wedding night that had not been a wedding night at all. She sat up quickly and looked toward the hearth. He was gone. The blanket was folded neatly on top of the wooden chest with perfect corners and crisp edges, like he had done this 1,000 times before. Through the small window, she could see him already in the distance, walking toward the barn with a tool over his shoulder. The morning sun turned his dark hair almost golden. Something inside Maggie had shifted overnight. She did not yet understand what it meant, but she knew with a certainty that surprised her that she had been wrong about something. This silent man with his fortress face and his cold blue eyes was not what she had expected. He was not what she had feared. And maybe, just maybe, this life she had dreaded might not be the prison she had imagined. She rose from the bed and smoothed down her nightgown. There was work to be done. Whatever this marriage was or was not going to be, she was still a wife, and wives had duties. She would earn her keep. She would be useful. She would give him no reason to regret the coins he had paid to bring her here. It was the least she could do for a man who had given her a mercy she never expected to receive. The fire had burned down to coals, and she set about building it back up the way her mother had taught her. The days that followed would teach her many things about this land, about this cabin, about this man who spoke in silences and showed his heart through actions rather than words. But she did not know any of that yet. All she knew as she started the fire and began her first full day, as Margaret Brennan was, that she had survived the first night. And sometimes survival was enough. The days that followed fell into a quiet pattern. It was not a comfortable rhythm at first. It was the cautious dance of two strangers sharing a space. Neither of them had chosen, each moving carefully around the other, like dancers who had never learned the same steps. Maggie woke each morning to find the fire already burning. He must have risen before dawn to build it up so the cabin would be warm when she got out of bed. She would dress quickly and come out to find coffee already made, the pot sitting on the hearth with steam still rising from its surface. Two tin cups set out side by side on the table, a gesture so small it could almost be missed, but it was there nonetheless. He would be gone by then. Already outside doing the work that never ended on a farm this size. She learned his schedule by observation, piecing together the rhythm of his days through the sounds that filtered through the cabin walls and the evidence he left behind. 4:30 in the morning he woke. She knew because she had started waking earlier herself, lying still in the bed and listening. She could hear him moving quietly in the pre-dawn darkness, the soft rustle of fabric as he dressed, the creak of the floorboards as he walked to the door. Then silence as he went out to begin the first task of every day. 5 o'clock, he milked the cows. 6 of them, which meant an hour of work, at least sitting on a three-legged stool in the dim barn, with his head pressed against warm bovine flanks, his strong hands working in the rhythmic pull and squeeze that sent streams of milk hissing into metal pails. She had watched once from the cabin window, had seen the patience in his posture, the gentleness with which he spoke to the animals in a voice too low for her to hear the words. 6 o'clock, he cooked breakfast. Simple fare. Oatmeal or cornmeal mush, sometimes eggs, if the hens were laying, well bread from a loaf he baked once a week in the Dutch oven. He would leave her portion on the table covered with a clean cloth to keep it warm, and then he would go out to the fields. 12 noon he returned for the midday meal. 20 minutes, that was all he allowed himself. He would eat whatever she had prepared, drink a cup of water, and then return to whatever task occupied him. Plowing in these early weeks, turning over the soil in preparation for late planting. The work was endless and exhausting, and she could see it in the set of his shoulders when he came in the way his hands trembled slightly as he raised his fork. 7:30 in the evening, he finished for the day. A final check on the animals, making sure they had food and water for the night, looking for any signs of injury or illness that might require attention. Then he would come inside for the evening meal. 8 o'clock, they ate in silence. Then he would wash the dishes while she sat and mended clothes or darned socks. And when the last light faded from the sky, he would spread his blanket on the floor in front of the hearth and lie down with his back to the bed. Every night, the same routine, the same choice. The floor instead of the bed. Distance instead of claiming what was his by law and contract. Maggie established her own routine in the spaces between his schedule. She cleaned the cabin, though it was already remarkably tidy for a bachelor household. She washed clothes in the big wooden tub outside, heating water over an outdoor fire and scrubbing fabric against a washboard until her knuckles were raw. She collected eggs from the chicken coop, learning to move slowly so as not to startle the hens, learning which ones were broody and would peck at her hands if she reached beneath them. And she cooked. Lord help her, she tried to cook. The first week was a disaster. She had cooked before, of course. She had helped her mother prepare meals for their family since she was old enough to reach the work table. But cooking on an open hearth was different from cooking on the iron stove her mother had possessed. The heat was harder to control, the flames temperamental, the heavy cast iron pots awkward to manage when suspended from the crane arm over the fire. Day one, she burned the biscuits. Not just browned them too much, but genuinely burned them to the point where they were black on the outside and raw in the center. They looked like lumps of coal and tasted worse. Day two, the stew was so salty it was nearly inedible. She had misjudged the amount of salt, adding what looked right, but turned out to be 3 times too much. Day three, the cornbread came out hard as a rock. She had not added enough liquid, and the result was something that could have doubled as a doorstop. Day four, the chicken was undercooked. She had thought it looked done, but when he cut into it, the meat was still pink near the bone. She had wanted to die of embarrassment. Day five, she forgot to stir the beans, and they burned on the bottom of the pot, giving everything a scorched, bitter flavor. Every night, he ate what she put in front of him. Every burned biscuit, every over-salted stew, every piece of undercooked meat. He ate it all without a single word of complaint. No grimace of distaste crossed his face. No heavy sigh of disappointment left his lips. He simply ate what she gave him, methodically and completely, and when he was done, he nodded his thanks and went about his evening routine. Maggie could not tell if this was patience or indifference. She could not read his face, could not interpret his silence. Was he being kind, understanding that she was learning a new skill in a new kitchen? Or did he simply not care enough to comment, accepting bad food, the way one accepts bad weather as an unpleasant fact of life not worth remarking upon? She did not know, and not knowing drove her to distraction. By the second week, she had begun to improve. The biscuits were merely mediocre instead of terrible. The stew had the right amount of salt. The cornbread was edible. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. And slowly, gradually, she began to notice other things. Things he did that spoke in the silent language she was learning to read. The path from the cabin to the chicken coop had been rough when she first arrived, full of loose stones and uneven ground that made it easy to trip in the dim morning light. One morning, she noticed it had been cleared. Every rock removed, the dirt packed down smooth and level. He must have done it in the early hours before she woke, must have spent time he did not have, making her daily trip safer. The water buckets were heavy when full, too heavy for her to carry comfortably without stopping to rest halfway between the well and the cabin. She had struggled with them for days, sloshing water over the sides and arriving at the cabin with aching arms. Then one morning she came out to find them already filled and sitting by the door, the water fresh and cold from the well. He had done it before leaving for the fields. The fire was always burning when she woke, the cabin warm against the cool prairie mornings. He could have let her wake to a cold room and build the fire herself. Instead, he rose earlier before the sun to make sure she had warmth. These were not grand gestures. These were not words of love or declarations of affection. But they were something. They were care expressed in the only language this silent man seemed to know. The language of actions, of time spent, of thought given to her comfort even when she was not watching. It was on day 14 that everything changed. Maggie had been trying to make cornmeal cakes. Her mother used to make them on special occasions, golden and crispy on the outside, tender on the inside, sweet, with just a touch of honey. The memory of that taste of home and happier times had been gnawing at Maggie all morning. She wanted to recreate it, wanted to prove to herself that she could make something beautiful instead of merely edible. The cast iron skillet was heavy, and she had heated it over the fire until it was properly hot, just as she had watched her mother do countless times. The batter was ready, mixed to the right consistency with just enough cornmeal and flour and eggs and milk to make a dozen small cakes. She reached for the skillet to adjust its position over the flames to find the perfect spot where the heat was even and strong. Her hand wrapped around the long iron handle, and she forgot. In her concentration on getting everything right, in her focus on recreating her mother's recipe, she forgot to grab the thick cloth she had set aside specifically for handling hot metal. Her bare palm closed around the cast iron handle. The pain was instant and blinding. White-hot agony that shot up her arm like lightning, so intense and so unexpected that she cried out before she could stop herself. A sharp involuntary sound of pure pain that echoed in the small cabin. The skillet clattered from her hand and fell to the hearth. The batter spilled out, hissing and smoking as it hit the hot stones and turned immediately to char. All her work, all her careful preparation ruined in an instant. But Maggie barely noticed. She clutched her hand to her chest, gasping, tears streaming down her face before she even registered that she was crying. The burn was bad. She could already see the angry red welt rising across her palm, could see the skin beginning to blister almost immediately. She stood there shaking, trying to blink back the tears, angry at herself for being so careless, so stupid, so weak as to cry over something so foolish. This was her own fault, her own carelessness, and now she had wasted food and made a mess and proven herself to be exactly as incompetent as she feared. She did not hear the door open, did not hear his footsteps across the floor. She only knew he was there when his hand gently took hold of her wrist. She flinched at the touch instinct born of a lifetime learning that hands reaching for you usually meant pain was coming. But his grip was light, careful, holding her wrist steady while he turned her palm upward to examine the burn with those pale blue-gray eyes that never seemed to give anything away. Then without a word, he led her to the water barrel by the door. He lifted the wooden lid and guided her hand into the cool water, holding it there beneath the surface. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. The cold dulled the sharp edge of the pain, turning it from unbearable to merely agonizing. Maggie let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and her shoulders sagged with the release of tension. He stood beside her, only one hand still supporting her wrist, keeping her hand submerged. He did not speak, did not ask how it happened or scold her for being careless. He simply stood there, patient and still waiting for the initial shock of the burn to fade. Minutes passed. The water warmed around her hand as her body heat transferred to it. The worst of the pain began to recede, settling into a steady throb instead of the sharp agony of the first moments. When enough time had passed, he led her to the table and sat her down in one of the chairs. Then he crossed to a shelf above the wash basin and took down a small tin box she had not noticed before. Inside was a pale yellow salve that smelled of herbs and rendered animal fat. He returned to her side and knelt down beside her chair, bringing himself to eye level with her. The position was unexpected, almost deferential. This tall, strong man lowering himself to her height instead of looming above. He took her hand in both of his. His hands were large and calloused, roughened by years of hard labor, scarred from 1,000 small injuries accumulated over a lifetime of farm work. They should have been rough, should have been harsh against her burned skin. But his touch was incredibly gentle. He spread the salve across the burn with a lightness that seemed impossible for hands so large, so careful not to press too hard on the damaged skin. Then he wrapped her palm with a strip of clean cotton cloth, tying it off with a knot that was secure but not tight. The whole process took perhaps 5 minutes. He never spoke a single word. When he was finished, he stood, gave her one small nod, and turned to go back outside. But at the door he paused, turned back, looked at her sitting there with her bandaged hand cradled against her chest. "You did good," he said. 3 simple words in that deep, steady voice. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Maggie sat at that table for a long time afterward, cradling her bandaged hand and thinking about his touch. How gentle it had been, how careful, how he had known exactly what to do, had moved with the practiced ease of someone who had treated burns before, who had learned perhaps through his own injuries the proper sequence of care. Water first to stop the burning process, salve second to promote healing, bandage third to protect the damaged skin. He had noticed her cry of pain from outside the cabin, had dropped whatever he was doing and come immediately. He had not hesitated, had not questioned, had simply acted to provide comfort and care. This was not indifference. A man who was indifferent would not move so quickly, would not know the proper treatment so thoroughly, would not touch with such careful gentleness. He cared. In his own silent way, in his own unspoken language, he cared. That small act stayed with her long after the pain faded. and the silence between them began to change. It was still there, still vast, but it no longer felt empty. It felt full of things being said in a language she was only beginning to understand. 3 days later, a horseman appeared on the horizon. Visitors were rare. In the 2 weeks Maggie had been at the farm, no one had come calling. The Brennan property was isolated 8 miles from the nearest town, with only one neighboring farm within easy riding distance. So when Maggie saw the figure approaching in the mid-morning heat, she felt a flutter of anxiety in her chest. The rider was well-dressed for the frontier. A suit jacket despite the heat, a broad-brimmed hat, and he sat his horse with the ease of a man accustomed to fine animals. The horse itself was remarkable. A chestnut gelding, well-fed and groomed, worth more than most farmers earned in half a year. Ethan emerged from the barn, where he had been repairing a section of stall. He stood in the doorway watching the rider approach with an expression Maggie could not read. But she noticed his hands. They curled into fists at his sides, then deliberately relaxed, a tell she had learned to recognize. Whatever this visitor wanted, Ethan was not pleased to see him. The man dismounted with practiced grace and removed his hat. He was perhaps 45 years old, with silver threading through dark hair and sharp features that suggested intelligence and calculation in equal measure. "Brennan," he said by way of greeting. His voice was smooth, educated, nothing like the rough speech of most men out here. "I trust you received the documents I sent." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I did." "Then you understand the situation." The man pulled a leather portfolio from his saddlebag and withdrew several sheets of paper. "I've come to discuss terms." "There's nothing to discuss, Dalton." So this was Marcus Dalton. Maggie had heard the name once when making purchases at the general store in Millbrook. The storekeeper had mentioned him as the owner of the bank and the largest landholder in the county, a man of means and influence. "I'm afraid there is quite a lot to discuss." Dalton's tone was pleasant, but there was steel underneath. "Your homestead claim is in jeopardy. The law is quite clear on the matter of continuous residence. You violated the terms of the Homestead Act in 1873. That makes your claim void." Maggie saw Ethan's shoulders stiffen. "I had good reason to leave." "I'm sure you did. But reasons, however good, do not change the law." Dalton spread the papers on the porch railing. "I have an affidavit here from your neighbor, Mr. Whitmore, testifying that you were absent from this property for approximately 6 months. I have county records showing no tax payment for that year. And I have survey maps showing that I filed a competing claim on this quarter section while the land was effectively abandoned. I came back. Eventually, but the damage was done. According to the Homestead Act of 1862, a claimant must reside continuously on the land for 5 years and make improvements. You left. You failed to maintain continuous residence. Therefore, your claim is invalid and the land reverts to public domain, where I have already filed." Maggie watched Ethan's face. It remained carefully blank, but she could see the tension in every line of his body. This was bad, worse than bad. "What do you want?" Ethan's voice was flat. "To resolve this amicably." Dalton's smile was thin. "I'm willing to offer you $400 for the property. That's more than fair, given that your legal position is untenable. It will give you enough to start over somewhere else. This land is mine. I've worked it for 4 years. You worked it illegally. Your claim was voided the moment you left in 1873. Dalton began gathering the papers. "I'm giving you 2 weeks to consider my offer. After that, I'll file suit in territorial court. The legal fees alone will bankrupt you, and you'll lose anyway. Take the $400, Brennan. It's more than you'll get otherwise." He mounted his horse with the same easy grace and touched his hat brim in a gesture that might have been respectful if not for the satisfaction in his eyes. 2 weeks. Consider carefully." He rode away, leaving a silence that felt heavy as stone. Ethan stood motionless on the porch, staring at the papers in his hand. Maggie could see his fingers trembling slightly, the only outward sign of the turmoil she suspected was raging inside him. She stepped out onto the porch. "What does it mean?" He looked at her, then really looked at her for the first time since Dalton's arrival. His eyes held something she had not seen before. Not quite fear, but close. Uncertainty. Vulnerability. "Means I might lose everything I've built." His voice was rough. "Means my past mistakes are coming back. Means you might have been sold to a man with nothing." The words hung between them. Maggie felt the weight of them, understood the implications. If he lost the farm, what would become of them? Where would they go? What did a failed farmer do on the frontier when he had no land, no prospects, no future? Where did you go in 1873? The question came out before she could stop it. Ethan was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Then slowly, as if each word was being dragged from some deep place inside him, he began to speak. I had a wife, Sarah. Married her in 1871 when I was 27 and she was 18. Maggie felt something cold settle in her stomach. A wife. He had been married before. In 1873, she was with child. Money was tight, tighter than tight. I heard about a gold strike up in the Black Hills in Dakota Territory. Men were coming back with pockets full of nuggets, talking about fortunes waiting to be picked up off the ground. His voice was bitter now, self-mocking. I thought I could go for a few months, come back with enough gold to build a proper house, buy better equipment, give her the life she deserved. He paused, staring at nothing. I left her here alone, pregnant and alone. Told her I'd be back in 3 months with gold in my pockets and grand plans for our future. What happened? There was no gold. Not for me anyway. Just debt and shame and 6 months of wasted time chasing a fool's dream. His hands clenched on the papers, crumpling them. When I finally came back, broke and defeated, I found 2 graves out back. Fresh graves. The neighbor had buried them 2 weeks before I returned. Maggie's breath caught. Both of them. Ugh. Sarah tried to deliver the baby herself. Something went wrong. She died trying and the baby died with her. A boy. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. The neighbor found them 3 days later when she came to check. Too late to save either one. The horror of it washed over Maggie in waves. A young woman alone and terrified, dying in childbirth with no one to help her. A baby that never drew breath. All because the man who should have been there protecting her had gone chasing gold. That's why I sleep on the floor, Ethan said quietly. I don't deserve the bed, don't deserve comfort or happiness, or any of the good things in life. I let my wife die. Let my son die because I was greedy and foolish and weak. He turned to her then and she saw the guilt written in every line of his face. That's why Dalton's claim has merit. I did leave. I did violate the homestead law. Everything he said is true. That's why you sent for a mail-order bride instead of courting someone properly, Maggie said slowly, understanding dawning. You didn't think you deserved real love. Thought a purchased wife was all you were worth. Ethan nodded once, sharp and bitter. Seemed fitting. A transaction for a man who turned everything into a transaction, who put gold ahead of the woman who loved him. Maggie stood there on the porch processing this information. Everything made more sense now. His silence, his distance, the floor, the careful, deliberate way he never touched her. He was not just being respectful, he was punishing himself. And she was part of that punishment, a constant reminder of his failure, a penance he inflicted on himself daily. The realization should have made her sad, should have made her pity him. Instead, it made her furious. So that's what I am to you. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. Punishment. Penance, you bought me to live in your guilt. I'm a memorial to the woman you couldn't save. Ethan's eyes widened. No, I didn't mean it like that. Then how did you mean it? Maggie stepped closer, her burned hand throbbing with her elevated heartbeat. You think I'm Sarah. You think having me here somehow makes up for losing her. You're not Sarah. I know I'm not Sarah, I'm Margaret, but you don't see that, do you? You see a 19-year-old girl who needs rescuing, who needs protecting, and it lets you feel like maybe this time you can get it right. This time you can keep someone safe. That's not fair. None of this is fair. Her voice rose despite her best efforts to control it. I was sold to you like livestock, brought here against my will to be wife to a man who doesn't even want a wife, who wants a ghost to apologize to every night when he chooses the floor instead of the bed. Ethan stood there, struck silent by her outburst. Maggie could feel tears burning in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had cried enough, had been weak enough. Not anymore. I'm not your redemption, she said, her voice shaking but firm. I'm not your second chance to save someone. I'm a person, Margaret Hayes, and I deserve better than being part of your self-flagellation. She turned and walked into the cabin, needing distance, needing space to breathe. Behind her, she heard Ethan say her name, but she did not stop. Could not stop. If she stopped, if she looked at him, she would break completely, and she could not afford to break. The door closed between them, and Maggie pressed her back against it, breathing hard. Her hand throbbed where she had clenched it during her speech, the burn protesting the abuse. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional turmoil raging inside her. She was falling in love with him. That was the terrible truth she had been trying to ignore. Somewhere between the floor and the fire and the burned hand and all the small kindnesses, she had started to fall. And discovering that she might be nothing more than a stand-in for a dead woman, a way for him to ease his guilt, was more painful than any burn could ever be. She slid down to sit on the floor, wrapped her arms around her knees, and finally let the tears come. Outside, she could hear nothing. No footsteps, no voice calling her name. Just silence. The same silence that had defined their marriage from the beginning. But now it felt different. Not peaceful, not comfortable, just empty. 2 days passed in strained quiet. They moved around each other like strangers again, all the small progress they had made evaporating in the wake of Sarah's ghost. Ethan went about his work with mechanical efficiency. Maggie cooked and cleaned with the same detachment. They ate in silence, but it was not the companionable silence of before. It was the silence of two people who had things to say, but no idea how to say them. On the third evening, the sky began to change. Maggie noticed at first the way the clouds were building on the western horizon, tall thunderheads that caught the setting sun and glowed orange and gold and ominous purple. The air felt thick, heavy with moisture and electricity. The animals were restless. She could hear the cattle lowing in the distance, nervous sounds that set her own nerves on edge. Ethan had ridden out that morning to check the fence line on the eastern border of the property. It was a long ride, 5 or 6 miles out and back, and he had said he would not return until well after dark. Maggie had watched him go, had wanted to say something, anything to bridge the gap that had opened between them, but the words would not come. Now, watching those clouds build and build, she wished she had tried harder. The storm was coming. She could feel it in her bones, could smell it on the wind. This was not going to be a gentle spring rain. This was going to be violent. She went about her evening routine, but her eyes kept straying to the window, watching the light fade and the clouds advance like an army across the sky. She collected the eggs, fed the chickens, brought in extra firewood in case the storm lasted through the night. All the while, a growing anxiety gnawed at her insides. Where was he? He should be back by now. The storm was almost here. As full dark fell, she heard it. A sound from the barn, low and distressed. Not the cattle, not the horses. Something else. Maggie lit a lantern and made her way across the yard to the barn, the wind already picking up and tugging at her skirts. Inside, the horses shifted nervously in their stalls, but her attention was drawn immediately to the far corner. Bessie, their best milk cow, was down on her side. Her brown eyes rolled with pain and fear, and the sounds coming from her throat were the sounds of an animal in serious distress. She was in labor. Maggie's heart sank. Bessie was not due to calve for another 2 weeks. Early births were dangerous. Complications were common. And from the way Bessie was thrashing and bellowing, this was not going well. Maggie approached, slowly, speaking in soft, soothing tones, the way she had watched Ethan do with the animals. She knelt beside Bessie and did a quick examination. What she saw made her stomach clench with fear. The calf was positioned wrong. She could see enough to know that. Calves were supposed to come front, feet first, then nose, then shoulders. But this calf was breached. One leg was folded back and the head was not in the birth canal at all. If the calf did not get straightened out, Bessie could not deliver it. And if Bessie could not deliver it, both mother and baby would die. Maggie had seen births before. Her family in Ohio had kept 2 cows and she had assisted her mother when they calved. She knew the theory of what needed to be done. The calf had to be repositioned. Someone had to reach inside, find the folded leg, straighten it, and guide the head into proper position. But knowing what needed to be done and actually doing it were 2 very different things. She looked around the barn desperately as if help might materialize from the shadows. But there was no one. Ethan was miles away, would not be back for hours. The nearest neighbor was 4 miles in the opposite direction, too far to reach in time, and she could not leave Bessie anyway. It was just her, alone, with a dying cow and a calf that would not survive without intervention. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, threatening sound that promised the storm was nearly upon them. The barn walls creaked in the rising wind. Bessie bellowed again, a sound of pure agony. Maggie made her decision. She removed her shawl and rolled up her sleeves to the shoulders. She went to the water bucket and scrubbed her hands and arms as thoroughly as she could. Then she returned to Bessie and knelt in the straw beside hers. "I'm going to help you," she said to the cow, though she was not sure if she was trying to reassure Bessie or herself. "We're going to get your baby out. Just trust me." What followed was the most difficult thing Maggie had ever done in her 19 years of life. She had to time her actions between Bessie's contractions, working in the brief windows, when the cow's body was not actively trying to expel the calf. She had to reach inside, feeling in the hot darkness for the calf's leg, finding it folded at an unnatural angle. She had to grasp it firmly and pull, straightening it despite the resistance. Despite Bessie's bellows of pain, despite the way her own muscles screamed with the effort. Then the head, harder still. The calf was large and the birth canal was not dilated properly for the awkward angle. Maggie had to push the calf back slightly, counterintuitive, as it seemed to create enough room to maneuver the head into position. Her arms ached, her back screamed, sweat poured down her face and soaked through her dress. Outside, the storm broke. Rain hammered against the barn roof like fists demanding entry. Lightning flashed through the cracks in the walls, turning everything blue-white for split seconds before plunging back into shadow. Thunder shook the ground. Maggie barely noticed. Her entire world had narrowed to this one task. Reposition the calf, save Bessie, save the baby. Nothing else mattered. She did not know how long it took. Time became meaningless, measured only in contractions, in the incremental progress of moving a large animal through too small a space. But finally, she felt the shift. The calf's position changed. The head aligned, the legs straightened. "Now, Bessie," she gasped. "Push now." The cow needed no encouragement. With a final tremendous effort, Bessie delivered her calf in a rush of food and blood. It slid free and lay still in the straw, a small wet bundle that was not moving. Maggie's heart stopped. Dead. After all that, the calf was dead. But then she saw it. A small shudder, the tiniest movement of the ribs. The calf was breathing, alive. She fell back into the straw, her arms covered in blood and birth fluids, her hair coming loose from its braid, her entire body shaking with exhaustion and relief. Bessie was already turning, already beginning to lick her baby clean, with her rough tongue, her maternal instincts overriding the trauma of the difficult birth. Maggie watched through tears she did not remember starting to cry. They had made it. Both of them. Against all odds, in the middle of a storm, with only her hands and her determination, they had survived. That was when the barn door flew open. Ethan stood silhouetted against the lightning, soaked to the skin, rain streaming from his hair and clothes. He must have ridden hard when he saw the storm coming, must have pushed his horse to its limits to get back before the worst of it hit. He stood frozen in the doorway, taking in the scene. The newborn calf, Bessie licking it clean. Maggie collapsed in the straw covered in blood, exhausted, victorious. His eyes went wide. For a long moment he just stared. Then he crossed the barn in 4 long strides and dropped to his knees beside her. "You saved them," he said. His voice was rough with something that might have been awe. "Both of them." Maggie nodded, too tired for words. "Margaret." He said her name, her full name. Not Maggie, not ma'am, but Margaret. Her identity, herself. "What you just did, that takes strength most men don't have. Takes courage and skill and determination." He reached out and took her blood-covered hands in his. "I was wrong." "About what?" Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "About everything. About why I brought you here. I told myself it was practical, that I needed help with the farm, that this was just an arrangement, nothing more." He paused, struggling with words the way he always did. "But somewhere between the burned biscuits and the blue dress I haven't bought you yet, and tonight watching you fight for this calf's life, you stopped being an arrangement." "What am I then?" "You're Margaret, strong and brave and capable, and everything I didn't know I needed." His grip on her hands tightened. "You're not Sarah, you never were. You're you, and that's what I should have seen from the beginning." Maggie felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking apart, but breaking open like a seed breaking through soil to reach sunlight. "I'm not your penance," she said firmly. No, you're not my penance. You're my future. If you'll still have me. Outside, the storm raged on. Rain drummed against the roof. Wind howled through the cracks. Lightning turned the world bright and terrible and beautiful by turns. Inside the barn, Maggie looked at this man who had bought her, who had given her choice, who had slept on the floor for 2 weeks to give her time, who had just looked at her covered in blood and exhaustion and seen not weakness, but strength. I'll have you, she said, but not as your purchased bride, as your partner, your equal. Someone you choose because you want to, not because you need penance or redemption or forgiveness. I choose you, Ethan said without hesitation. I choose Margaret Hayes, who saves calves with her bare hands and burns biscuits and yells at me when I'm being a fool about ghosts. I choose you. And then there in the barn, with the newborn calf taking its first wobbly breaths and Bessie watching over them all, and the storm raging outside, Ethan Brennan leaned forward and kissed his wife for the first time. It was not practiced or smooth. It was awkward and tentative and tasted of rain and salt and something that might have been the beginning of love. When they pulled apart, both were breathing hard, both looking at each other with wonder. We should get inside, Ethan said finally. Storm's bad. Maggie nodded, but before they left the barn and ran through the rain to the cabin, she said one more thing. I'm falling in love with you, and I choose to fall. Ethan's response was to kiss her again, longer this time, deeper. When he finally pulled back, his eyes held something she had never seen before. Not guilt, not shame, but hope. Then we'll fall together, he said. They made their way through the storm to the cabin, running hand in hand through rain that soaked them within seconds. Inside, they stood dripping on the floor, laughing breathlessly at the absurdity of it all. The tension of the past 2 days had broken along with the storm, washed away by rain and truth and the simple act of choosing each other. That night, Ethan did not spread his blanket on the floor. Instead, at Maggie's invitation, he lay beside her on the bed, still fully clothed, still outside the covers, but there, between, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, could hear his breathing steady into sleep. It was not consummation. Not yet. They were not ready for that. But it was progress. It was trust. It was two people who had been thrown together by circumstance, beginning to choose each other by design. And in the morning, when Maggie woke to find him already gone to milk the cows, she did not feel abandoned. She felt cherished, because there on the table, still warm from the fire, was a cup of coffee made just the way she liked it. The small gestures continued. The silent language of love, spoken through action rather than words. And Maggie was learning to speak it back, learning to show care through the meals she cooked that were getting better every day, through the way she mended his clothes with careful stitches, through the small kindnesses that built a life together. But even as they grew closer, even as the walls between them began to crumble, the shadow of Marcus Dalton's threat loomed over everything. 2 weeks. That was all they had to figure out: how to save the farm, how to fight a legal battle they could not afford against a man with money and power and the law on his side. The days were ticking down, and neither of them knew what they were going to do when time ran out. The morning after the storm dawned clear and cold, the kind of crystalline Kansas morning where everything seemed scrubbed clean and new. The rain had washed the dust from the air and left the prairie grass sparkling with droplets that caught the early sun like diamonds. Maggie woke to the smell of coffee and something else, something that made her heart catch in her throat. Fresh bread. He had baked bread while she slept. She rose and dressed quickly, her body aching in places she had not known could ache from the exertion of the night before. Her arms were sore from the shoulder to the fingertips. Her back protested every movement. But beneath the physical discomfort was something else. A warmth, a sense of rightness that had been missing since the day she arrived. The cabin was empty when she emerged from behind the privacy curtain she had rigged near the bed, but the evidence of his presence was everywhere. The fire burning bright and warm, 2 cups of coffee on the table, steam still rising from both, a loaf of bread on the cutting board still warm enough that butter would melt on contact. And something new. Something that made her pause and look twice to be sure she was seeing correctly. His blanket was not folded on the chest. It was draped across the foot of the bed, as if claiming space there, as if saying without words that he would not be sleeping on the floor anymore. The gesture was small, practically invisible to anyone who did not know their history. But to Maggie, it meant everything. It was a choice made visible, a statement that things had changed between them and would continue changing. She sat at the table and wrapped her hands around the warm coffee cup, breathing in the rich aroma and feeling for the first time since leaving Ohio like she might actually be home. Through the window, she could see Ethan in the distance, checking on Bessie and the newborn calf. The little one was on its feet, already wobbly, but determined, nursing from its mother with the single-minded focus of the very young. Both animals had survived the night. Both were going to be fine. The parallel was not lost on Maggie. She and Ethan had survived their own difficult birth of sorts. The painful process of becoming something new. Something neither of them had expected or planned for. Something that was beginning to feel like it might actually work. But even as she sat there savoring the coffee and the quiet morning and the small domestic pleasures of bread and warmth, she knew that the shadow of Marcus Dalton's threat still hung over them. 10 days. That was all they had left before the deadline. 10 days to figure out how to save everything. She was still sitting there lost in thought when she heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Maggie's first thought was that Dalton had returned early, that he had decided not to wait the full 2 weeks. But when she went to the door and looked out, her heart stopped entirely. The wagon was better than the one Silas Kern had driven, pulled by 2 horses instead of one, with a canvas cover that was clean and well-maintained. And the man driving it, the man who was even now pulling the horses to a stop in front of the cabin, was a face Maggie had never expected to see again. Her father. James Hayes had come to Kansas. For a moment, Maggie could not move, could not breathe, could not process what she was seeing. Her father, who had sold her 2 months ago, who had taken Marcus Dalton's money and signed the papers and sent her away without a backwards glance, was here, on her husband's property, without warning or invitation. Ethan appeared from the barn, walking quickly when he saw the strange wagon. His hand went instinctively to his belt, where he sometimes carried a knife for farm work. Not a weapon exactly, but not nothing either. His body language was alert, protective. He positioned himself between the wagon and the cabin, between the stranger and his wife. James Hayes climbed down from the wagon with care. He was dressed better than Maggie had ever seen him. A clean suit, not new but well-maintained. Polished boots, a hat that had clearly been brushed recently. He looked prosperous in a way he never had back in Ohio, and the sight of it made something cold and hard settle in Maggie's stomach. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying across the distance, "I've come to bring you home." The words hung in the air like smoke. Maggie felt Ethan tense beside her. She had not realized he had moved closer, but he was there now, standing just slightly in front of her. Not blocking her, not caging her in, but present. A solid wall of support if she needed it. "What are you doing here?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "What I should have done 2 months ago." James Hayes pulled a leather satchel from the wagon and approached slowly, his hands visible and empty of weapons. "I made a mistake, Margaret. A terrible mistake. And I've come to make it right." He reached the porch and set the satchel down. The way it hit the wood, the heavy thunk of it, told Maggie it was full of something weighty. Coins, she realized. He had brought money. The late crop came in, her father continued, speaking directly to her as if Ethan were not there at all. "Best harvest we've had in 6 years. Better than anyone expected. We paid off the bank. Paid off every debt. The farm is secure. The family is stable." He paused, and something that might have been shame flickered across his face. "We can afford you now." The phrasing was unfortunate. "We can afford you," as if she were a luxury item they had been forced to do without, like a new plow or a milk cow, and could now reclaim because their financial situation had improved. "I brought $500, James said, gesturing to the satchel. "The same amount you were sold for. I'll pay it back to Mr. Brennan here, void the arrangement, and you can come home. Be with your family. Find someone you actually choose to marry." He said it as if he were offering her the world, as if this were the solution to all problems, the happy ending everyone had been waiting for. Maggie felt something building in her chest, not relief, not gratitude, but a slow, burning anger that started small and grew with every second she looked at her father's earnest face. "You have consulted a lawyer, I assume?" Ethan's voice was flat, emotionless. "About the legality of voiding a marriage performed by proxy." James nodded. "The marriage was legal in Kansas territory, yes, But Margaret never gave consent in person. She was underage at the time by the standards of some states, though not by Kansas law. And most importantly, if the marriage has not been consummated, it can be annulled on the grounds of fraud or coercion. He looked uncomfortable discussing such matters, but plowed ahead anyway. Margaret, has this man, has he touched you? The question hung in the air, intimate and invasive. Maggie felt her face flame with embarrassment and fury in equal measure. That's none of your business, she said sharply. It's every bit my business if it determines whether I can get you out of this situation legally. James took a step closer. Margaret, please. I know I was wrong. I know what I did was terrible. But you're my daughter. You're 19 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you. Don't waste it out here in the middle of nowhere married to a man you didn't choose. There it was, the crux of his argument, the assumption that she could not possibly want this life, that given any other option, she would naturally choose to leave. And 2 months ago, he would have been right. 2 months ago, if someone had offered Maggie an escape from this marriage, from this lonely cabin in the middle of an endless prairie, she would have taken it without hesitation. But 2 months ago, she had not known what it felt like to have someone build a fire for her before she woke, had not known what it felt like to be touched with gentleness when she was hurt, had not known what it felt like to be seen not as property or burden or obligation, but as a person, as Margaret. She looked at Ethan. He was standing very still, his face carefully blank, but his hands were clenched at his sides, and she could see the tension in every line of his body. He was waiting for her decision. He would not speak for her, would not tell her what to do, would not try to convince her one way or the other. He was giving her the same thing he had given her that first night. Choice. Real choice. Even if it cost him everything. Maggie turned back to her father. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong and utterly certain. No. James Hayes blinked. What? I said no, I'm not going with you. Margaret, don't be foolish. You can come home. Be with your family. You don't have to stay here. You're right, Maggie said, and she felt something shift inside her as she spoke. I don't have to stay here, but I choose to. That's the difference. You sold me when it was convenient for you. Now you want me back because it's convenient for you. I am not convenient. But I'm your father. Were you my father when you signed those papers? The words came out sharp as broken glass. Were you my father when you took Mr. Pritchard's money and didn't ask me what I wanted? Were you my father when you sent me away without even saying goodbye properly? James Hayes flinched as if she had struck him. I did what I had to do to save the family. You sold your daughter. Don't dress it up as something noble. Maggie took a step forward and she felt Ethan move with her, a silent presence at her back. You want to know what happened here? I arrived terrified. I thought I'd been sold to a monster. I thought my wedding night would be the worst night of my life. She gestured to Ethan without looking at him. This man slept on the floor for 2 weeks, gave me time, gave me space, gave me the choice you never did. He looked at me like I was a person, not a problem to be solved, or a mouth to be fed, or a daughter to be bartered away. Margaret, I know you're angry, but you need to think about your future. I am thinking about my future. My future is here. She took a breath, steadying herself for what came next. Do you want to know the truth? I'm falling in love with him. This man you sold me to like livestock. This stranger you thought I couldn't possibly want. I'm choosing him. Not because I have to, not because I'm trapped, but because when I look at my life, when I think about where I want to be and who I want to be with, the answer is here. James Hayes stood silent, his face a mixture of shock and something that might have been hurt. After everything I did for you, after I came all this way, you came all this way for yourself, Maggie said, but the anger was fading, now replaced by something that felt almost like pity. To ease your conscience, to undo a decision you regretted. But you can't undo it. What's done is done. I'm not the girl you sold 2 months ago. I'm someone different now, someone stronger. And I'm not leaving. She looked at Ethan, then really looked at him and saw in his eyes something that made her heart catch. Pride. Respect. And underneath it all, the raw vulnerability of a man who had expected to lose and was just beginning to believe he might not have to. I choose this, she said, speaking to Ethan now instead of her father. I choose you. I choose us. Ethan's response was immediate. He closed the distance between them in two long strides and took her hands in his. His voice, when he spoke, was rough with emotion. "Margaret Hayes Brennan, will you marry me?" She laughed, the sound coming out somewhere between a taupe and genuine amusement. "We're already married. Not the way I want, not the way you deserve." He dropped to one knee right there in front of her father, in front of God and the endless prairie sky. "Marry me for real. Not because your father signed papers, not because money changed hands, but because you choose to. Because I'm asking and you're saying yes because you want to, not because you have to. Marry me properly, with vows that mean something, with witnesses, with a choice that's yours and only yours." Maggie looked down at this man kneeling in the dirt of his own front yard. This man who had been so broken by guilt that he thought he did not deserve happiness. This man who was offering her everything he had and asking for nothing but her choice in return. "Yes," she said. The word came out clear and strong. "Yes, I'll marry you. I choose you. I choose this life. I choose us." Ethan stood and kissed her right there in full view of her father, in full view of anyone who might be watching. It was a declaration, a statement, a claiming that went both ways. She was his and he was hers, and neither of them was property. They were partners, equals, two people who had chosen each other against all odds. When they broke apart, James Hayes was still standing there, the satchel of money at his feet, looking like a man who had come to rescue his daughter and found she did not need rescuing after all. "Margaret," he said quietly, "if you're sure, I've never been more sure of anything." He nodded slowly, accepting defeat. "Then I wish you well." He picked up the satchel, hefted it back into the wagon. "If you ever change your mind, if you ever need anything, you know where to find us." "I know." He climbed onto the wagon and took up the reins. Before he drove away, he looked at Ethan directly for the first time. "You take care of her. You treat her right." "Every day of my life," Ethan said. It was a vow. James Hayes drove away, the wagon disappearing down the long trail until it was just a speck on the horizon, and then nothing at all. Maggie watched him go and felt no regret, no sadness, only a sense of finality. That chapter of her life was closed. This was her family now. This man beside her, this land beneath her feet, this life they would build together. Ethan turned to her, and she saw in his face the same wonder she felt. Against all odds, against all reason, they had found each other. Two people who should never have worked, who had been thrown together by desperation and economics in the casual cruelty of a world that treated people like commodities, had somehow become something real. "We need to plan a wedding," Maggie said, and despite everything, she was smiling. "We do." Ethan paused, then added, "And we need to deal with Dalton. 7 days left." Reality came crashing back. In the drama of her father's arrival and the emotional declarations that followed, Maggie had almost forgotten about the threat hanging over them. Almost, but not quite. "Then we'd better get started," she said. That afternoon, they rode together into Millbrook. It was the first time Maggie had been to town since her arrival, and she felt different now. Not like a mail-order bride hiding her shame, but like a woman with purpose, with a partner beside her, with a future to fight for. The lawyer's office was on the second floor above the general store. Theodore Walsh was a young man, perhaps 30, with sharp eyes and a sharper mind. He listened to their story without interruption, occasionally making notes on a pad of paper with quick, decisive strokes. When Ethan finished explaining about the 1873 absence and Dalton's competing claim, Walsh sat back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "Dalton's right about one thing," he said finally. "The Homestead Act does require continuous residence. Leaving for 6 months is a violation." Maggie felt her heart sink, but Walsh held up a hand. "However, the law also provides exceptions for temporary absences due to legitimate business. The question becomes whether your trip to the Black Hills qualifies as temporary and legitimate." He pulled out a thick book, thumbed through it until he found the page he wanted. "There's case law. A gentleman in Colorado left his claim for 4 months to work in the silver mines. Court ruled it was acceptable because he was earning money to improve the homestead, and he maintained the property through an agent." "I didn't have an agent," Ethan said. "Are you certain?" Walsh leaned forward. "Did you arrange for anyone to check on the property while you were gone, to maintain it in any way?" Ethan frowned thinking. Mrs. Cooper from the neighboring farm. I asked her in a letter to keep an eye on things. She fed the chickens, watered the garden. That's an agent, an informal one, but still. Did you order any supplies to be delivered to the property while you were away? Anything that would show you intended to return and continue working the land? I ordered seed, Ethan said slowly, memory clearly coming back. In March of that year from the catalog, to be delivered in April for spring planting, and tools, a new harrow blade in May, and winter supplies in July to be picked up when I got back. Walsh smiled. It was the smile of a hunter who had just spotted his prey. Do you still have receipts, order confirmations? I might. I kept all the farm papers in a chest. Find them and find Mrs. Cooper. Get her testimony in writing that she maintained the property at your request while you were temporarily away on business. Walsh made another note. Dalton's case rests on the assumption that you abandoned the property. We need to prove you didn't, that you maintained continuous interest even if you weren't physically present, that your absence was temporary and for legitimate economic purposes. Will that be enough? Maggie asked. It should be. Dalton's playing a legal game betting that you won't fight back, that you'll take his low offer rather than go through the expense and uncertainty of court. But if we can show you have a legitimate defense, he might be willing to negotiate. What kind of negotiation? Walsh looked thoughtful. What does Dalton really want? He's a land speculator. He doesn't need this particular quarter section. There must be something specific about it that makes it valuable to him. Ethan's eyes widened. The creek. There's a spring-fed creek that runs through the southeast corner of my property. Only reliable water source for miles in dry season. Water rights, Walsh said with satisfaction. He doesn't want your land, he wants your water. Probably planning some development needs guaranteed water access. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. What if you offered him an easement legal right to draw water from the creek in exchange for dropping his claim and paying for the privilege? How much would an easement be worth? To him, potentially more than the $400 he offered for the whole property. To you, you keep your land, your home, everything you have built. You just share the water. Walsh tapped his pen against the desk. Let me draft a proposal. Meanwhile, you find those receipts and get Mrs. Cooper's testimony. We'll be ready when Dalton comes calling. They left the lawyer's office with something they had not had when they entered. Hope, a plan, a fighting chance. The next 3 days were a flurry of activity. Ethan searched through every paper he had saved, finally finding the order receipts in an old ledger book stuffed in the bottom of the chest. Maggie rode to the Cooper farm and sat in their kitchen, while Mrs. Cooper, a sturdy woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and capable hands, wrote out her testimony in careful script. Yes, she had checked on the Brennan property weekly during the summer of 1873. Yes, Mr. Brennan had written to her asking for this help. Yes, he had clearly intended to return, had spoken of his plans for the harvest, had arranged for everything to be ready when he came back. They also made plans for their wedding, not elaborate plans. Nothing that required money they did not have or time they could not spare. But real plans. Reverend Thomas, the circuit preacher, would be in Millbrook in 2 weeks. They could arrange for him to come to the farm afterward. The Coopers would stand as witnesses. Maggie would make her wedding dress from the blue fabric Ethan had promised to buy her, but had not yet had the chance. About that fabric, Ethan said one evening as they sat together planning. They were sitting close now, shoulders touching, comfortable with casual contact in a way they had not been before. I should have gotten it already, for your dress. We'll go to town tomorrow, Maggie said, after we deal with Dalton. Because tomorrow was the day, the deadline, the moment when everything would be decided. Marcus Dalton arrived precisely at noon, as if he had calculated the time for maximum dramatic effect. He rode his fine horse up to the cabin, dismounted with his usual practiced grace, and approached the porch with a folder of papers under his arm, in the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. Brennan, he said by way of greeting, I trust you've had time to consider my generous offer. I have, Ethan said. He was standing on the porch with Maggie beside him and Theodore Walsh on his other side. The lawyer's presence, clearly surprised Dalton, made him pause and reassess. I'm not selling. Then you're prepared to fight this in court, as I explained the legal fees alone will bankrupt you and you'll lose anyway. Dalton's confidence was unshaken. Your claim is invalid. You violated the homestead requirements. The law is quite clear. The law is also clear about exceptions for temporary absences on legitimate business, Walsh said smoothly. He pulled out his own folder. Mr. Brennan has receipts showing he ordered supplies to be delivered to this property during his absence. He has testimony from a neighbor that she maintained the property at his request. He has evidence of continuous interest and intent to return. Your case, Mr. Dalton, is not nearly as solid as you've been representing. Dalton's eyes narrowed. Those supplies could have been ordered from here before he left. The dates on the receipts show otherwise. March, May, and July of 1873. He didn't leave until February, which we can prove through his last tax payment. The orders were placed while he was away, sent to the property in care of his neighbor acting as agent. Walsh smiled. Would you like to proceed to court because I'm quite confident we'll win, and then I'll countersue for harassment and malicious claim. The reputational damage to your bank and land company would be considerable. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Dalton was clearly recalculating, reassessing his position. He was a businessman, and businessmen knew when to cut their losses. What do you want? He said finally. Walsh glanced at Ethan, who nodded. We understand you need water access. The spring-fed creek that runs through the southeast corner of this property. Dalton's face remained impassive, but his eyes flickered with interest. We're prepared to offer you a permanent easement, Walsh continued. Legal right to draw water from the creek for any development you're planning. In exchange, you drop your claim against the property and pay a fair price for the water rights. How much? $200 for the easement, plus you pay Mr. Walsh's legal fees, which are currently $50. Dalton was quiet for a long moment, doing calculations in his head. Finally, he nodded. That's acceptable. Just like that, it was over. The threat that had hung over them for 2 weeks, that had cost Ethan sleep and put shadows under Maggie's eyes, was resolved with a contract and a handshake in money-changing hands. Walsh drew up the paperwork right there on the porch, using the railing as a makeshift desk. Both men signed. Dalton pulled a bank draft from his pocket, already made out for $250, as if he had anticipated this outcome. Perhaps he had. Perhaps this had always been his goal, to use the threat of legal action to leverage what he really wanted at a price Ethan would accept. Pleasure doing business with you, Brennan, Dalton said as he mounted his horse. If he was disappointed at not getting the entire property, he did not show it. Enjoy your land. He rode away, and Maggie felt something tight in her chest finally release. They were safe. The farm was secure. The future was theirs to build. Ethan turned to Walsh and shook his hand. Thank you for everything. My pleasure. It's always satisfying to outmaneuver a man like Dalton. Walsh gathered his papers. Now I understand. Congratulations are in order. When's the wedding? 2 weeks from Saturday, Maggie said. You're invited if you'd like to come. I wouldn't miss it. After Walsh left, Ethan and Maggie stood together on the porch, looking out at the land that was truly theirs now. 160 acres of Kansas prairie. Not much by some standards, a small kingdom by others, but it was theirs, earned and fought for, and worth every moment of struggle. We should go to town, Ethan said. Get that blue fabric for your dress. They rode into Millbrook together, side by side on the wagon seat, their shoulders touching with every bump in the road. At the general store, Ethan bought 3 yards of the most beautiful blue cotton Maggie had ever seen. The color of a clear spring sky, the color of hope, the color of new beginnings. And on impulse, he bought something else. A small paper-wrapped parcel from the bakery next door. When they were back on the wagon, he handed it to her. What is it? Maggie asked. Open it. Inside was a honey cake, still warm, golden, and perfect. The smell of it brought tears to her eyes because it reminded her of home, of her mother's kitchen, of special occasions and happy times. But this was different. This was not nostalgia for the past. This was sweetness in the present, a gift given not out of obligation but out of care. They ate it together on the ride home, breaking off pieces and savoring the taste of honey and happiness in the simple pleasure of sharing something good. That night after dinner, as the sun set and painted the prairie gold and rose, Ethan did not immediately go about his evening routine. Instead, he took Maggie's hand and led her outside. They walked together to the small rise behind the cabin, where the view stretched for miles in every direction. I want to show you something, he said. There on the far side of the rise were two small graves, wooden crosses weathered but still standing. The names carved into the wood were fading but still legible. Sarah Brennan, Baby Boy Brennan. Maggie felt her breath catch. She had known the graves must be here somewhere, but she had not expected this. Had not expected him to bring her here willingly. I used to come here every night, Ethan said quietly, to apologize, to promise I'd be better, to punish myself for failing them. He was silent for a moment, then continued. I haven't been here since the night of the storm. Since you saved Bessie and the calf. Since you made me realize that living in the past was just another way of being dead. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. I'll always remember them. I'll always carry the regret of not being here when Sarah needed me. But I can't change the past. I can only choose the future. His voice grew stronger. And I choose you, Margaret. Not as a replacement, not as penance, but as my partner, my love, my future. Maggie felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but they were not sad tears. They were tears of release, of healing, of two people who had both been broken, finding a way to be whole together. I choose you too, she said, every day for the rest of my life. They stood there on the rise as the sun set, hands clasped facing forward instead of back. The graves were still there, still part of the landscape, still part of Ethan's story. But they were no longer the center of it. They were the pad. Honored, remembered, but not lived in anymore. The future was ahead of them, and they would walk into it together. 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Maggie sewed her wedding dress by lamplight, every stitch a meditation on the life she was choosing. Ethan repaired every piece of fence, cleaned every corner of the barn, made sure the farm was in perfect order. They were getting ready not just for a wedding, but for a marriage. A real one, built on choice and trust and the kind of love that grows slowly from shared work and mutual respect. On the morning of the wedding, Maggie woke early and looked at herself in the small mirror that hung near the wash basin. She looked different than she had 2 months ago. Her skin was tanned from working outside. Her hands were calloused from labor. Her hair had lightened in the sun. But more than the physical changes, there was something different in her eyes. A confidence, a strength, a certainty about who she was and what she wanted. She was no longer the frightened girl who had stepped off a wagon into an unknown life. She was Margaret Brennan, farmer's wife, partner, woman who saved calves and burned biscuits and chose her own future. She dressed carefully in the blue dress she had made, and when she looked at herself, she saw a bride, not a transaction, not a commodity, but a woman on her wedding day about to marry a man she loved. The ceremony was held outside in the late afternoon when the worst heat of the day had passed. Reverend Thomas stood before a simple wooden arch that Ethan had built and Maggie had decorated with wildflowers gathered from the prairie. The Coopers were there dressed in their Sunday best. Theodore Walsh had come as promised, looking pleased to witness the happy ending to a case he had won. A few other neighbors had heard about the wedding and come to offer their good wishes. But the crowd did not matter. The only thing that mattered was Ethan standing at the altar in a new shirt Maggie had made for him, his hair neatly combed, his eyes fixed on her as she walked toward him across the prairie grass. When she reached him, he took her hands, and she could feel his trembling slightly. This strong, silent man was nervous. The realization made her love him even more. Reverend Thomas spoke the traditional words. Love, honor, cherish, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, till death parts us. Words spoken at 1,000 weddings, but somehow they felt new, fresh, meaningful in a way Maggie had not expected. When it came time for personal vows, Ethan pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. His hands shook as he unfolded it, and Maggie realized he had written this out, had practiced it, had agonized over getting the words right. Margaret, he read, his voice rough with emotion. I promise to choose you every day. Not because papers say I must, but because I cannot imagine not choosing you. I promise to show you love through actions when words fail me. I promise to build a life with you worth living. I promise never to make you feel second to anyone living or dead. You are my first choice, my only choice, my forever choice. He folded the paper with shaking hands and looked at her, waiting for her response. Maggie did not have written vows. She spoke from her heart. Ethan, I promise to stay, Not because I was bought, but because I'm home. Promise to trust you with my heart, my life, my future. I promise to be your partner, not your property. I promise to remind you you're worthy of happiness when you forget. You gave me choice that first night. I choose you now. I choose you tomorrow. I choose you forever. The ring Ethan slipped onto her finger was simple gold, ordered from a catalog, and engraved on the inside with the date and the words chosen. It was the most beautiful thing Maggie had ever owned. You may kiss your bride, Reverend Thomas said, smiling. Ethan cupped Maggie's face in both his hands and kissed her. Not tentatively like before, but with confidence, joy, and love that had been earned through trial and truth in the daily choice to see each other clearly. The small crowd cheered. Mrs. Cooper dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Mr. Cooper clapped Ethan on the back with congratulations. Walsh raised a glass of cider and toast. They celebrated with a simple meal that Maggie and Mrs. Cooper had prepared together. There was laughter and stories and the kind of easy warmth that comes when people genuinely care for each other's happiness. As the sun began to set, the guests gradually departed, leaving Ethan and Maggie alone at last. Truly married, truly chosen, truly in love. Inside the cabin, Maggie lit candles while Ethan built up the fire. They moved around each other with the ease of long practice. Now no awkwardness, no uncertainty. When the candles were lit and the fire was burning, and they had no more tasks to occupy nervous hands, they stood facing each other in the warm glow. Are you nervous? Maggie asked. Terrified, Ethan admitted. I want this to be perfect for you. It doesn't need to be perfect. She took his hands. It just needs to be us, together. Finally. What followed was tender and awkward and beautiful in the way first times often are. There was fumbling and laughter and whispered questions. Is this okay? Yes. And this yes. Gentle exploration and growing confidence, and the overwhelming rightness of two people who had chosen each other, finally becoming one in every sense. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the quilt, Maggie's head on Ethan's chest, his arm around her shoulders, their legs intertwined. No distance between them anymore. No walls, no floor, just togetherness. I love you, Maggie said. The words came easily now. I love you too, Ethan replied. Then, because he could not help himself even now. Since when? Since you fought for that calf beside me. Since you looked at me covered in blood and saw strength instead of weakness. Since you gave me choice when no one else ever did. She tilted her head to look up at him. Since you became more than the man who bought me. Since you became Ethan. My Ethan. He kissed the top of her head, and they lay there in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the prairie. The wind in the grass, the distant call of an owl, the crackle of the fire, all the sounds of home. The years that followed were good ones. Not easy. Farming never was. There were droughts that tested them, winters that seemed endless, crops that failed despite their best efforts, the constant grinding work that never truly stopped. But they faced it all together. In the spring of 1811, Maggie discovered she was pregnant. The news brought equal parts joy and fear, especially for Ethan, who could not help but remember Sarah. But Maggie was strong and healthy, and when their daughter was born in the fall, it was an easy delivery that left both mother and baby thriving. They named her Sarah Margaret. Sarah for the woman Ethan had loved and lost, Margaret for the woman who had taught him to live again. The name was healing, a bridge between past and present, a way of honoring memory while embracing future. In 1879, their son was born, James Ethan, named for both grandfathers as a gesture of peace and forgiveness. Maggie's father never came to visit, but she wrote to him occasionally letters that grew warmer over the years as old wounds slowly healed. In 1881, their youngest child arrived, Grace, named for the grace of second chances, for the mercy of unexpected kindness, for the grace that had brought two unlikely people together and made them family. The cabin grew with the family. Ethan built additions, a room for the children, a larger kitchen, a proper bedroom with a door that closed. The farm prospered. They never became wealthy, but they were comfortable, secure, happy. The children grew up knowing both work and love. Ethan taught them to farm, to fix things with their hands, to value silence and action over empty words. Maggie taught them to read and write and think for themselves, to question, to choose their own paths. Together, they taught their children that love was not something that simply happened, but something you built day by day, choice by choice, through commitment and care. And every night, Ethan and Maggie fell asleep in the same bed, holding hands across the quilts, grateful for another day together. Another choice made, another promise kept. Years passed. The children grew, married, had children of their own. The farm that had once seemed so isolated became the center of a growing family network. Holidays brought everyone home. Grandchildren played in the same yard where their parents had played. The stories were told and retold. The history was preserved. And in the spring of 1916, as an old man sat on his porch telling his grandson about bravery and choice and the power of love, built on respect, those years telescoped into something clear and true. Thomas listened to the end of the story with tears in his eyes. "You really slept on the floor for 2 weeks." "Every night," Ethan confirmed. "Why? Because she deserved choice, because I had to earn what I